Welcome to Friday night's video in our second master series. I do believe this is the 67th video in our second master series, the 16th video on our basic processors, and the third video on our reverb and convolution. So basically, in this video, I want to do a couple things. The first thing I want to do is address a problem that people try to get themselves tons of impulse responses that don't do them a lot of good. That they should really focus on some basic ones that they can use across the board. And also about we can sound sculpt our impulse responses. So let's deal with the first thing first. The first thing is, the idea is when I first got my convolution reverb, I didn't really understand, and I wasn't really understanding how to apply it. And so I was using other types of reverbs, besides my convolution reverb, and I'd choose different ones every now and then till I figured out my convolution reverb was my big gun. It just really is, and there was no way to get around it. And the other types of reverbs I was using, there didn't really seem to be much point to them, because any sound that they affected the sound with, that I eventually broke down to, it's something I need to deal with in my sound sculpting. And I don't want relying on my reverb to do my sound sculpting. So in the old days, back in the old days, we kind of had to. And the reverb would add some textures and sounds and things to the sound on top of it. And so we would go to it like a certain type of compressor, an old school compressor that, well, I like my compressor because it adds a certain type of saturation, noise, and distortion, and it sounds great, and I love it across the board. Yeah, dude. Well, nowadays you can do it in the box and do it much better. We'll get into that when we get into our next biggest gun, which is our noise, saturation, distortion. But right now we're focusing on our convolution reverb. So the understanding of this is when I first got it, I got tons of responses. I've only got these ones here, but I had tons of them. And I eventually figured out I wasn't using them for nothing, ever, no how, no way. So I was like, well, so why aren't I? Because I kept going to certain ones because I wanted to get used to using them, being comfortable using them, understanding what they were going to do to a piece of audio, and getting good at knowing which one to pick and grab and use for a certain application when I'm trying to put something in its space or I'm trying to sound scope it. We'll talk about that in later videos when we talk about the couple different applications of our convolution reverb is bodybuilding and spatialization are two separate things. So basically, the first myth that I want to break is now I'm not saying you don't, but sometimes I went through this thing where I had got a bunch of like plate reverbs, spring reverbs, all kinds of things like that, until I realizes it was like the tin can effect. It adds a spectral change to the impulse response and sound, which is great, but you can deal with that with equalizing and sound sculpting. When you're equalizing and when you're sound sculpting, you're going to affect the sound the way you want it there, rather than relying on the reverb. I'm not saying don't. You might, you get a couple of spring reverbs, plate reverbs, or other exotic reverb impulse responses or something like that that are really cool that, you get, that you experiment with, that do something really cool in one situation. We've talked about that, it's branching out, going, I'm going to try something really different, in this application, and da-da-da-da. That's okay. But most of the time, you becoming a master audio engineer and mastering your second biggest gun being your convolution reverb is you're not going to be wanting to do that. You will die in front of the mixing board. Plus, you will never master them well. So, to fix that problem is that I've got 5 basic impulses, and I'll explain to you why. I've got a large hall, a medium hall, a small hall, and 2 very large halls. Like, cathedral kind of things, right? For a reason. Just about any application of something I'm going to put someplace in some space is either going to be a small hall, a medium-sized hall, or a large hall, or some type of auditorium effect or cathedral thing, right? Most of the time. So I broke it into 5 different ones. Now, what I did with those 5 different ones is I broke them down into, I broke them into different sizes. If you go back and watch those videos on the C50 clarity guides, there's a playlist on those that 50 milliseconds, 40, 30, 20, and 10 milliseconds. And I also, besides the untouched waveform, I also, and those have been really cleaned up like we talked about in the last video. And then I also got a stack of them, of the same ones that are that same large Hall untouched, except for I've flattened the frequency response. So the frequency response on these are all flat, just like having good studio monitors that have a flat frequency response. My impulse responses all have a flat frequency response. So the frequency response of those impulse responses, like the tin can affecting the sound, don't affect my piece of audio, right? With different sizes. Now, that's one thing. And also, I've got them here. I can put a flat frequency response on there, or I can put them on there and equalize them. I can put the equal loudness contour on them, or I can boost the bass on them at a high end a little bit, and then bounce that file and throw it in my convolution reverb for a certain application. Simple applications, right? Because most time I just go to these and I'm good to go, because I rely on my sound sculpting, my equalization to sculpt the sound. I'm just trying to use it to spatialize things and to fatten things up and give things presence when I'm doing my bodybuilding. So this is a huge concept. That way that, you know, let's say I've got a small hall. Now, if I go to C50, I can make it sound like it's a bigger small hall. If I go down to C20 milliseconds, I can make it sound like it's a smaller small hall. I really can. Now, with these sizes, I get really familiar with these 5 impulse responses, so I can use them really well with my real delicate instrument, my convolution reverb. And also, you have to really take into consideration that, let's say I want it in a medium, a small hall, like a jazz cafe or something like that, then I'm going to want to add ambience. If I really want the effect of it sounding like it's has in that cafe, then I'm going to add ambience. You know, there's other effects and sounds, applause, people, you know, things that are going on that you can add little bits to here and there. Not much. I mean, like it's really obvious, but just enough to where, it doesn't take much for the listener to hear something and go, wow, it sounds like I was in a little jazz cafe or something, dude. Yeah, that is really cool. You know, it doesn't take much, a little bit of effects, but it has nothing to do with the reverb you used, other than it's a small space. Right? It's the effects and the ambience effects you use to just lightly, or just every now and then, just to give a little bit of show that it's in a jazz cafe or an auditorium or a big, someplace. That kind of stuff working in conjunction with it puts it more in its spot, right? So if you can get those two concepts in your head, you are well on your way to mastering this tool, because most of the time, when I've made a decision that this production is going to be in a medium hall. So I've got a medium hall, and then I start working with my medium-sized hall, or it's going to be in a small club or a small jazz cafe or a coffee house or something, or it's going to be in it's going to be in a real large hall, so, like almost like a Grange Hall or something like that, or bigger. It's going to be in an auditorium, which I have some in my large hall. I can make it sound like it's an auditorium, or I can go right into my cathedral or like Taj Mahal to really make it sound like it's in an auditorium, dude. And it'll, and working with it, I can make it sound there. But I master these impulse responses. That way, it's not so much of me running around trying to find different impulse responses. I've got a few of them here that I know really well, and then I utilize them a little bit differently with my convolution reverb. Even this simple one of my DAW is pretty complicated. It can do quite a few things that you can actually affect these impulse responses differently to make it sound a little bit differently, besides all the sound sculpting equalization work that you've probably done already to the individual track or the mix itself or whatever, right? So, you will start to break that down to a smaller platform that you're working from so that you can master those. That doesn't mean it'll change and you might add more to it and or every now and then go out on a limb and go, I'm really going to try this surround space. This hall, it sounds weird. Prison main floor, and it's got this strange sound, that really, it's putting it in or, you're going to make the vocals sound different and you're actually using it as a part of sound sculpting. I'm not dissuading you from that, but too much of messing with that is going to take you off course from mastering your convolution reverb, which is your next biggest gun, and using it well. Then you've cleaned these up, you've flattened the frequency response, you've left some of them alone, so you've got a little bit of a pick there from them, and you can re-equalize some of them from the flat frequency response ones that you've made, and you can drag those in your convolution reverb, be comfortable with them, understand them. They've been well cleaned up and worked on to where they're nice impulse responses, and then you can affect them a little bit differently if you need to. Does that make sense? Which you will probably be fine on. The next thing I want to talk about is you can also understand that here's a simple example. That instead of searching around for a bunch of impulse responses, my Sibelius software had these impulse responses in them. They're pretty good, bro. I mean, they are. There's a big room, a cathedral, a church, a small room, and a vocal chamber. That these are pretty good responses. This company that made this nice software that I used to write music took some time choosing the software, the impulse responses they wanted to use for their software because they sounded pretty good. They're great starting points rather than digging around the internet for impulse responses all over the place. And your computer probably has, my Apple computer had a bunch of pretty good impulse responses for what it uses in its system. Then it figured sounded pretty good that you can use as starting points to build great impulse responses, clean them up, cut them down, flatten the equalization on them, and you can sound sculpt them also. So these are huge places to start looking for some to help you get there. But this is a huge concept. That way you've got a limited amount that you're working for. You got a large hall, medium hall, small hall, and a couple of really big halls that are your bread and butter, that you can just about do any production with those. Does that make sense? Once you master using them and you master your convolution reverb, because if I stick this medium hall in here into here and I start fussing with all this other stuff that's on here, it's going to sound different. There's lots of parameters on here that we'll talk about later that can affect it differently and make it sound like it's almost not even the same impulse response. So it's a huge concept to get in your head to help you get to that next level as a master audio engineer, and breaking this down into a few impulse responses that you are really comfortable with that can get your stuff into those spaces is going to be hugely important. We'll also talk about some other responses that we're going to make for doing our bodybuilding, which are a little bit different than spatialization. You'll have to trust me on that. When we get into that in the videos, you'll understand, and you'll make another set of these up to do bodybuilding with, but we'll get to that. So I really hope you can understand that, you start focusing on that, spend some time working on them, and get some basic ones that are your go-to ones to get done what you want. Most of the time, those are where you're going to be putting things, in a small area, medium area, a pretty large area, or, a big hall, auditorium or a cathedral or something like that. You might throw a couple more different ones on there, but just be careful. It's quite a bit of work. I put a lot of work just in the few ones that you've seen here. Hours and hours and hours and hours and hours until they were cleaned up. They're beautiful impulse responses. But it was also a learning process. So I want you to be able to do that yourself so that you can go through that learning process to understand how you're affecting it, so they help you to better understand what it's doing and when it starts affecting the audio. So it's a huge concept. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, just really quick before the end of the video, is that you can sound sculpt your impulse responses. So anything we talk about in the first master series of sound sculpting, anything we talk about doing equalization or adding effects or anything, you can do that to your impulse responses to add different effects to these basic ones you use. You can pull one out, do some wild stuff to it, command bounce it or render it, and then use it in your convolution reverb for a certain song or a certain production or something like that. So, but that's going to take experimentation on your part, which is a whole nother story that we'll get to later. For now, focus on that to help you get to the next level, using your next big gun being your convolution reverb. So I hope I made that real simple. I hope I made that really clear to help you master this next big gun. And I will see you in the next